Hi guys, and welcome to the final lecture for Chapter 7. Today we'll be going over sustainable farming solutions, and we're going to address some of the problems that we posed with intensification of agriculture, as well as some issues with soil degradation that we talked about in the previous two lectures. Then we're going to move on more generally and talk about some of the issues with farming currently and how some of those issues can be remedied with sustainable agriculture. Now, the first form of soil degradation that we talked about in the previous lecture was soil degradation forms that came from over-irrigation, and that is again when we apply too much water to our soil in a way that can damage it, and that led to several distinctive forms of soil degradation. The first was salinization, the buildup of salts in the soil. The second was waterlogging, which was essentially flooding the soil, and the third was leaching, which was the downward transport of nutrients and basically starving plants in that soil by depleting that soil of nutrients. In addition, something we really didn't talk about was that over-irrigation is often just really wasteful in general. Only about 40% of irrigation or irrigating water actually reaches the plant, and the rest kind of just lands on the leaves, just kind of evaporates. So 40% of the water that we use to irrigate our crops is actually not even being used. So not only is over-irrigation pretty damaging to our soil, but it's also pretty wasteful in terms of wasting our water resources. Now, there are two basic solutions to over-irrigation. They both fall under the umbrella of sustainable irrigation practices. The first is more of a philosophical or ecological standpoint, and the second is far more practical and far more managerial. The first, that ecological standpoint, is to simply match the crops that you're growing to the climate that you're growing them in. A lot of times with the intensification of agriculture, it leads farmers to grow crops in places where those crops might not normally be able to survive. The conditions are too harsh, it's too hot, there's not enough natural rainfall, etc. And so to supplement that lack of natural rainfall, they continue to grow those same crops in that area, and they just add more water through irrigation. And again, this isn't necessarily the best way to do things. Ideally, you want to match your crops to your climate. You want to grow plants in a climate that they will be able to survive naturally, and then the extra irrigation you need is only that to boost yields, not necessarily just to keep your plant alive. For example, cotton is a very water-intensive plant, and we actually grow that in Arizona, which is a complete mismatch. You are growing a water-intensive crop literally in a desert. And so these are some of the ecological perspective fixes or implementations of sustainable agriculture. Moving to some of those practical or managerial standpoints, we can simply improve the efficiency of our water use. The first is through a technology known as drip irrigation. It's going to be over on the upper right-hand side of your screen. Remember how I said that around 40% of the water that we use to irrigate plants just kind of evaporates off? That's using a sprinkler water system. Essentially, we pour water on top of the plants, a little bit of it gets into the soil, the rest stays on the leaves and just evaporates. With drip irrigation, we slowly drip water directly into the soil, so it doesn't really have time to land on the leaves and then just evaporate. Instead, it is being directly inputted into the soil, and so it is far more efficient. In addition, we can also use something called rainwater harvesting. So instead of simply using irrigation water from a water reservoir, we can also collect water via rainfall in basins or rain barrels near the home or near the farm. Using that extra water that reduces our water inputs, and so again, we are reducing our water waste simply because we are not just relying straight up on a water reservoir. We can rely on some of the natural rainfall in our area instead. So these are some of the sustainable irrigation practices which can solve some of the problems associated with over-irrigation. So the next big problem that we had was over-fertilization, and this was going to be when we added too much fertilizer, too much nitrogen and phosphorus into our soils. And remember how we talked about that a soil can only absorb so much nitrogen and phosphorus, and after you keep adding fertilizer, after the soil has been saturated, the nitrogen and phosphorus just sits right on top of the soil where it can be washed away and cause groundwater or surface water pollution, i.e. either nitrates in the water supply or eutrophication in our water bodies, or even potentially even worse, it can react with sunlight and ambient air to volatilize that nitrogen in particular and cause air pollution. So over-fertilization can be a really big deal. Now, the solution to over-fertilization is using sustainable fertilization practices, and this relies on two different things. The first is something called precision agriculture, and the second is using a organic fertilizer perspective. Precision agriculture basically is using technology to monitor crop conditions and as well as crop needs, and in addition allocate resources accordingly. So basically we have a bunch of measuring tools in the field, and whenever resources, the nitrogen and phosphorus, gets too low, then you go out and you add your nitrogen and phosphorus. And this way the soil never reaches capacity, and we don't have all of that nitrogen and phosphorus sitting right on top of the soil where it can pollute air and water. So this is a really great thing for two reasons. The first is it reduces pollution, and the second is that it reduces cost. If you're not over applying fertilizer all the time, you're not wasting money on excess fertilizer. You can apply exactly as much as you need, and as a result the farmer is also better off because the farmer saves a lot of money. In addition, all of the native water bodies and native local populaces are also pretty happy because there's less air pollution and there is less water pollution. Moving forward, organic fertilizer is simply using fertilizers that are made through organic means. These are fertilizers from the remains or waste products of animals or organisms, and that can be things like manure, crop residues, compost, basically food waste from your local population. And because all of this comes from a natural means, it is very easy for organisms to rapidly break down that nitrogen and phosphorus from these organic sources. So because it is not this pure form of nitrogen and phosphorus, other organisms can rapidly break down that stuff, and so it reduces the capacity for actual pollution simply because these materials are taken up so quickly. So basically using precision agriculture and organic fertilizers are a great way to reduce the problem of over-fertilization. And so the final cause of soil degradation that we talked about in the previous soils lecture was degradation associated with overgrazing. And this is simply when you have too much livestock eating all of the plant cover on your cropland or your rangeland. And what this does is if plants are being eaten faster than they can grow, it can reduce plant growth and plant cover on that soil. And when the soil is then exposed, it can be eroded via wind or water, and we can have invasive species, which are often less palatable, come in, invade, and take advantage of that free space, and then you have problems associated not only with soil loss but also with invasive species, and it can reduce the ability of that system or of that rangeland to maintain that native plant growth. And so the solution to overgrazing is simply using sustainable grazing practices. This is going to be monitoring the pasture or the rangeland that we are having our livestock graze on, and monitoring what the carrying capacity is of that rangeland. Basically knowing the number of cattle or livestock that rangeland can sustain over time, and making sure that we don't put too many animals on that cropland or rangeland so that we can keep that system nice and healthy. In addition, we can also cycle the livestock population around from rangeland to rangeland so that any one area isn't depleted too rapidly. Now, the classic case of soil mismanagement and consequently soil degradation that your book offers is going to be that of the Dust Bowl. Basically what happened was in the 1920s, farmers began to realize that the grasslands in the Midwest of the United States were great for growing crops, and this goes back to some of the soil characteristics of grassland biomes. Remember that we talked about grassland biomes had that very large and well-developed topsoil or a soil horizon. Basically, this is a soil horizon that has lots of nutrients and organic matter that are great for growing crops. So what these farmers did was they gradually replaced that native grassland vegetation with crops such as wheat, as well as plants that were really great for raising cattle and livestock. However, there was a problem. They didn't match the crops to the climate. Basically, these crops that these farmers began to plant all over the Midwest were not suited for the periodic disturbances such as major droughts that these grasslands experience from time to time. The native vegetation could tolerate these droughts just fine, but the crops immediately died off once these droughts started to happen. So what happened was, all of a sudden, when these crops began to die, you had nothing covering the soil in the Great Plains. Remember how grasslands have these very well-developed root structures, so they hold down soil really, really well. However, these crops such as wheat and the crops that we were using to raise livestock didn't have these great root structures, and so as a result, when these plants died, the soil was completely freed, and so it was able to be swept up in the air by wind. As a result, millions of tons of topsoil was lost simply from wind erosion, and the Dust Bowl, the name the Dust Bowl, came from all of the erosion of these soils were swept up and actually caused dust storms. So we lost an enormous amount of nutrients and soil cover in the Midwest because of this soil mismanagement. As a direct result of the Dust Bowl, the United States began to employ conservation soil practices as a way to combat erosion. In fact, in 1935, the Soil Conservation Act was passed, which started the Soil Conservation Service. Now, you really need to understand the consequences associated with the Dust Bowl, as well as the Soil Conservation Act and the Soil Conservation Service. Basically, this is a service that manages soil and works on maintaining soil integrity so that we don't experience anything like this again. Now that brings us to different types of sustainable agriculture and soil management practices, and so for the latter half of this lecture, we're going to spend some time going over each of the 6 major types of sustainable agriculture and soil management practices. Then moving forward, we're going to go into pesticide use and biological and chemical controls of pests, and then finally we're going to talk about the environmental costs associated with raising livestock for consumption, as well as genetically modified organisms. Now, the first sustainable agriculture practice that we're going to talk about is crop rotation. That's basically the practice of alternating the crops that you plant on a given field from year to year. And basically the philosophy goes like this: different crops take up different nutrients in different quantities in a given field because different crops have different nutrient needs based on how they evolved. So if you plant different crops in the same field year after year, it gives that soil time to regenerate the nutrients that any one specific crop needs in a given year. So if you plant the same crop over and over and over again on a soil, you deplete specific resources that crop needs. However, if you shift things around and you plant different crops on the field over and over again, no one nutrient gets depleted too severely and it maintains your soil integrity. And what a lot of farmers do is they do a lot of crop rotations with a type of crop known as legumes. These are going to be crops such as beans, chickpeas, lentils, specific types of crops that we grow for food, but they have the additional value of being able to fix their own nitrogen. Instead of applying fertilizer, they actually suck nitrogen out of the air and convert it into ammonium and then nitrate, which then you can use in your soil. So in addition to rotating your crops, a lot of farmers rotate their crops with legumes in order to bolster the soil nitrogen at any one given time. And so crop rotation is a great way to maintain your soil integrity so that no nutrients get used up. But what about erosion? Well, there are 2 specific types of practices that are really useful for combating erosion, particularly erosion when you are farming along a hill. The first is going to be something called contour farming, and you can see that over on the right-hand side of your screen. And this is the practice of plowing furrows perpendicular to a given hillside as a way of slowing water running down that hill, and in addition slowing down erosion. Basically, if your hill looks like this and your slope is going down this way, basically what you're going to do is you're going to plow furrows perpendicular to the hill lengthwise. Now what that does is that as water runs down, it stops over and over again as it hits any one of these furrows, and that slows the water down so it doesn't sweep away a bunch of your soil. Another way to combat this is something called terracing, and in terracing what we do is instead of plowing furrows, we actually cut out sections of the hill in a way that makes a bunch of different flat surfaces. This way water literally cannot flow down the hill, and instead it collects in these pools, which are great for growing things such as rice. So not only are you minimizing erosion, but you're creating a great environment to grow specific types of crops. And so while contour farming and terracing are great for stopping erosion along a hillside, what about on flat land? And this is where things like shelterbelts and conservation tillage come into play. Conservation tillage describes approaches that reduce the amount of plowing or tilling related to conventional farming. Basically, tilling can be a pretty good thing when you're trying to get your soil prepared for planting crops. What tilling does is it aerates the soil so it gets a lot of air trapped in the pore space of our soils, and it works in weeds and crop residues, the residual amounts of crops after you've harvested, back into the soil. So it gives a lot of nutrients to the soil, and it gives a lot of air to the soil, which is really good for bolstering your crop yields. However, this comes at a cost. Whenever you till or over-till a given area, what this does is it leaves the soil exposed to wind, which can get all that topsoil swept away. So all of those hard-working gains that you got with aerating and nutrifying the soil get swept away with erosion. Conservation tillage tries to find like a happy medium in between completely tilling your soil and no tilling whatsoever. So in this way, you get some of your nutrients and aeration back into the soil, but not so much tilling that you risk having all of your topsoil swept away through erosion. Moving forward, shelter belts are another way to combat erosion in that this is where we plant narrow rings of trees around our farms as a way to stop wind from coming in and sweeping through. What this does is it essentially acts as a barrier for wind, and it slows down erosion. Now finally, a great sustainable farming practice is that of intercropping. And intercropping is where we plant multiple different types or species of crops in alternating bands all around our farm. What this does is it increases biodiversity and it increases the productivity of that ecosystem. Basically, if you only have one crop in a given farmland, what you're doing is you're only utilizing certain ecological processes. But when you increase biodiversity in that land, all of a sudden what you're doing is you're having multiple different niches being filled by multiple different types of plants. Those different ecosystem services and biological processes can build off one another, and you can actually tremendously bolster the yields in your farm simply by promoting biodiversity. Pretty cool, right? So now that we've talked about some of the ways to mitigate soil degradation through things like erosion and soil mismanagement, as well as ways to bolster our yields through adding water and other types of nutrients, what about keeping our yields once we've created them? How do we keep other different types of insects from eating our food so that we can preserve it for people to actually eat? And this is where we get into some of the nuance with pesticides and pests, as well as pollination. Basically, pesticides are poisons that are specifically developed to target pest organisms, basically those insects that like to eat our food before we get our hands on it. And these include things like insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. Basically, insecticides are going to be targeting your insects that eat food. Herbicides and fungicides are going to attack different types of plants, bacteria and fungi that will also creep in and actually eat our food as well and decrease our yields. And since the advent of industrial agriculture and intensification, pesticides have risen dramatically over the last half century or so. In fact, pesticides have risen fourfold since 1960. That is tremendous, 400% increase. And this has led to something called pesticide resistance. And what pesticide resistance refers to is the gradual tendency of pests to become more and more able to tolerate the pesticides that were designed to kill them, to the point where pesticides gradually lose their effect to where they don't even work at all. And this is basically natural selection happening in real time. So in the beginning, look at the diagram over on the right-hand side of your screen. In the beginning, you have most pests in black that will die if you apply pesticides, and maybe you have one or two that naturally have a gene in them that allows them to tolerate greater levels of pesticide resistance. Well, then you apply your pesticide, and all of a sudden you kill most of the pests that could not tolerate the pesticide, but you don't kill the ones that can. So over the next generation, what happens is that now you've given the pests that have that gene that can tolerate pesticides, you've given them a competitive advantage, and they're the ones who get to breed more frequently, and they're the ones who get to pass down their genes to the next generation. Literally natural selection in a nutshell. Eventually, as you apply pesticides over and over and over again, the pests that don't have the genes to tolerate that pesticide get killed off. But the pests that do have the gene to tolerate pesticides continue to get to persist and produce more and more offspring. Eventually, after this happens enough times, just like any other beneficial mutation, eventually you're going to have a population that has the gene that allows them to survive in these pesticide-ridden environments. Basically, these pests over different generations become increasingly able to basically tolerate these pesticides, and then the pesticides no longer work. And again, I'm going to let you refer to the diagram on the right-hand side of your screen to get a conceptual idea of how this actually happens. But pesticide resistance isn't the only negative consequence of over-application of pesticides. In addition, exposure can do a lot of different things. First and foremost, it can kill off a lot of non-target organisms that we didn't intend to kill. Remember that insecticides, for example, kill off insects period, whether it's a pest or whether it's something that might be beneficial. And so as a result, honeybees, butterflies, and other pollinating insects that we actually want on our crops are rapidly being killed off very quickly in enormous quantities all around the globe as a result of over-application of pesticides. And this is a huge problem because we need those pollinators. We need organisms to go around and help these plants be able to pollinate their flowers so that we can get some of the benefits of that pollination. Things like fruit, for example, or different types of grains. In addition, there are other non-target impacts not necessarily related or confined to insects. For example, there are enormous losses of songbirds all around the United States and along the globe as a direct result of pesticide applications to insects. Birds like to eat some of those pests that we want to keep off our crops, and so when birds eat the dying insects that are being poisoned, they get poisoned themselves, and so insecticide applications can actually kill off a lot of our songbirds and is killing off a lot of our songbirds as well. Now, secondly, pesticides have some negative and some detrimental experiences to human health as well. Because pesticides can be moved, they can be swept up by wind or get into the water, they can adversely affect human health through inhalation of air pollution or through drinking pesticides that get washed into water reservoirs, and this has become a problem in a number of different places. So what I'm trying to say here is that we really need to be careful about when and where we apply pesticides so that we can minimize some of these negative and detrimental effects. So this might be a little bit doom and gloom, right? This is a pretty bleak outline. We're losing billions of songbirds across the entire globe. We're losing bees by the billions across the globe. There are some serious negative consequences to pesticides. So what can we do? Well, there are some solutions and alternatives to just over-application of pesticides if we want to maintain our crop yields. And this is through something called biological control and integrated pest management. Now, biological control is really interesting in that it introduces, instead of a pesticide, a predator which can control pest populations. Things like ladybugs, for example, over on the upper right-hand side of your screen, love eating pests like aphids, which we hate because they get into our crops and they eat all of our food. So by introducing predators or promoting predators or nearby areas around our farms, we can control different pest organisms by simply having things that like to eat them so that they don't eat our food. This is an example of top-down control, introducing predators to control the abundances of herbivores and promote growth of vegetation. Think back to chapter 4 when we were looking at things like keystone species and trophic cascades. While ladybugs aren't necessarily keystone species, predators like them do a really great job in controlling pests or those herbivores that eat our food. However, this should be done really carefully. If we introduce different predators that are non-native to that area, then we have the potential for an invasive species to run amok and ruin local ecosystems. So while biological control can be very useful, it should be used very carefully and only when we are certain that it will not have adverse effects to the surrounding ecosystems. Now, the next thing that I want you guys to consider is something called integrated pest management. And this is really when we get into the nuts and bolts of sustainable agriculture. In integrated pest management, we use a combination of biological control, those predators, as well as things like crop rotation and habitat diversification in order to minimize our pest organisms. Again, by promoting habitat around our farms, we promote habitat for the local predators that like to eat the pests that we're trying to control. By introducing predators as well as maintaining their habitat, we then greatly reduce the number of pest organisms. In addition, crop rotation is a really great way to minimize pest populations because certain pests like to eat certain types of food. If we rotate those crops around over and over again, we limit the abundance of any one pest because we are limiting their food supply. And finally, when we talk about integrated pest management, we're talking about promoting beneficial insects like pollinators in order to bolster our biodiversity and bolster our crop yields. So there are some serious solutions to promoting biodiversity, promoting yields, and decreasing the abundance of pest organisms without increasing our pesticide use. Now we're going to take the last couple of slides in this lecture to talk about some of the consequences of raising animals for food, and then diving into the topic of GMOs very briefly. Now, when we're raising animals for food, we need to keep in mind that there are some serious consequences to eating the Western diet, which is really heavy in red meat and meat in general, because a diet of beef, pork, or chicken have huge environmental consequences. And this is in terms of land, water, and energy that it takes to raise these animals. Now, by far, beef is the most environmentally taxing, but we're going to look at meat generally just for a second so that you understand exactly how many resources we're talking about. When we talk about eating a hamburger, for example, there is a statistic that indicates that there is an enormous amount of land, and I think something on the order of 100,000 liters of water for every kilogram of beef that we actually consume. And that might seem disproportionate, right? Like, how does all of that water go into just making one hamburger? There's not that much water in a hamburger. Well, what we're not considering is that it's not necessarily the amount of food and water a cow needs once it's an adult. It's the amount of food and water that a cow needs over the course of its entire lifetime, beginning from when it's a calf all the way up to when it is fully grown and big enough for slaughter. And think about how much water that you drink over the course of a year, and then multiply that out by 10, and then double or triple that amount, simply because cows are much larger animals. That is what we are talking about here. Because it takes an enormous amount of resources to raise an animal up to the point where it's able to be slaughtered, that is why there are so many resources in terms of food, water, and energy just to grow these organisms for our consumption. Now, again, by far, cattle is the worst, and this is essentially due to the fact that cows take a much longer time to grow, and they are much larger animals. Because the lifespan of a cow is a little bit longer, and because cows are larger animals, it takes more and more resources to raise it up to the point where we can actually slaughter it. Contrast that to chicken or pigs, and while pigs are still pretty bad, they are not as big as cows, and they do not take as long of a time to be raised to adults so that we can slaughter them. Chickens, on the other hand, grow pretty quickly, and their maximum size isn't that big, so we can raise a chicken to the point where we can slaughter it before it gets too massive. And so that's why pigs and chicken have far less resources associated with growing them in relation to cows. Again, cows are bigger, they take more resources to grow them. Chicken and pigs, smaller, and so it takes exponentially less resources to use them. And this is concerning because the global consumption of meat, and in particular red meat, is rising. And this is as multiple countries increasingly enter the developed phase of that demographic transition model. They become developed industrialized nations, and they increasingly take on the Western diet. And as a result, the consumption of meat is rising, and as a result, the affluence of any one given nation that has this diet is increasing. Basically, the per capita resource use is directly related to how much meat you eat, because you are eating something that takes a large environmental footprint to grow in and of itself. So eating meat significantly contributes to the environmental footprint of any one person or the affluence of any one given country. Now, some of you might be thinking, all right, what is this hippie environmental science professor trying to tell us to go vegetarian or vegan? Is that the only way that we can reduce our environmental footprint? And no, that's not necessarily the case. While eating meat, it does have a very large environmental footprint associated with it. Going vegetarian or vegan doesn't necessarily have to be the only option. Simply reducing the amount of meat that you eat in your diet or changing what kinds of meat you eat can also have a significant reduction in your environmental footprint. Remember that cows have a very large environmental footprint associated with them, but chickens or fish, for example, are far smaller. So by switching your diet from eating primarily steak and hamburgers all the time to eating more like chicken, not only is probably a little bit healthier for you because it cuts down on your risk of heart disease, but it also is much better for the environment. If you want to go vegetarian or vegan, that is awesome, that is up to you, but for me, for example, I like eating meat, and so I've just cut down on the amount of red meat I eat. I eat it pretty seldomly, and instead I eat a little more chicken. Eventually I kind of want to cut down on that too, but it's a nice stepping stool down, and if you don't want to make the next step down after that, that's completely up to you. But if you are focused on reducing your environmental footprint, laying off the hamburgers and steaks in favor of the chicken is probably the way to go. And lastly, we're going to spend a second talking about genetically modified organisms. Genetically modified organisms are basically where scientists merge the DNA of unrelated organisms together to create new genetic variants. For example, a gene of a fish could be inserted into a strawberry to make it more frost resistant, or far more commonly, there is a gene associated with a specific type of bacteria, the BX gene, that is inserted into plants to make them resistant to insects, basically creating a natural insecticide. We can also genetically modify plants in order to enhance the yields. For example, we could make a plant more efficient at using nutrients to enhance its nutrition. We can use that BX gene to enhance the plant's natural resistance to pest organisms and reduce pesticides, and we can make a plant more drought resistant to reduce our use of water. And this has had a lot of great success. For example, the Green Revolution used a more primitive version of GMOs in order to dramatically reduce starvation. However, there are a few problems with genetically modified organisms, and there's a lot of misconception related to genetically modified organisms. First and foremost, there is some misconception as to the health risks associated with GMOs, and by far and away, these are greatly exaggerated. Genetically modified organisms are not going to hurt you. You've been eating genetically modified organisms probably the majority of your entire life, and we have seen no negative downsides associated with them. There's a lot of misinformation indicating that they're bad for your health or something like that. No, they actually are not. This is pretty well tested, and while nothing can ever be proven true, refer back to our hypotheses over in the scientific method lecture. So while nothing can ever be proven true, the case is pretty much open and shut regarding the health risks associated with GMOs. However, there are still some problems with it. First is that they're expensive to create, and so a lot of companies that create GMOs actually patent their intellectual property, so you actually have to buy your seed from the companies that created them, and that can be really expensive if you're a farmer just trying to make ends meet. In addition, another downside is that GMOs can cross-pollinate. They can cross-pollinate with different weed species, which we've actually seen happen, particularly with GMO grasses and golf courses, and they can create pesticide-resistant weeds that we can no longer spray for and control with traditional herbicides. And in addition to all of this, pests can eventually evolve and develop a resistance to things like that BX gene that I was just talking about, and create super pests, because we have pushed natural selection so far to where we have incredibly hardy and resistant pests. So there are some downsides associated with GMOs, but there are also some serious upsides in terms of yields and reducing our inputs. And it can be a great way to bridging the needs of industrial intensification with extensification when we look at trying to find ways to reduce the amount of space we use to grow crops, as well as the inputs that we put into crops. So it's a great way to bridge that divide if it is used appropriately. Now, that is everything that I have for you guys for Chapter 7. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I cannot wait to talk to you guys about biodiversity and, more depressingly, biodiversity loss, which we will go over in Chapter 8. I'll see you guys then.